So, most people today are familiar with comics and comic books as the coal engine which churns out Hollywood blockbusters. The Avengers, Batman, and Superman all just started as comic book characters, to name a few. So regardless of your opinions on the movies, it's tough to argue that comic books have entered the mainstream in a major way. But to understand the present influence of comic books, it makes sense to revisit some of the major great works of the past. And that's exactly what we're doing with today's book report. Hey, this is Alex with Guys Can Read, and in today's book report, we're putting on our masks, tights, and American patriotism and reviewing The Watchmen, written by Alan Moore and illustrated by Dave Gibbons. Here's the table of contents. First, I'll walk through a summary of The Watchmen, this time including spoilers, and then talk about why I came back to reread The Watchmen after probably 5 years. Second, since it's been almost 40 years since The Watchmen was first released, I'll talk a little bit about the parts of the book that were relevant to the 1980s, and some of the parts that I feel like haven't held up as well in the 2020s. Third, just because it's fun, I'm going to highlight my favorite scenes or plot points from The Watchmen, and after, I'll finish by giving recommendations on who may and may not want to read The Watchmen. Now, with the doomsday clock ticking ever closer to midnight, let's dive in. The Watchmen is set in an alternate version of 1985, where the emergence of superheroes has altered the course of history from what we know in the real world. But much like reality in 1985, the world of The Watchmen is on the brink of nuclear war between the United States and the USSR. The plot begins in The Watchmen with the murder of Edward Blake, who we come to learn is a former masked vigilante named the Comedian who later worked for the US government. Rorschach, another masked vigilante still active despite a government ban on costume heroes called the Keene Act, investigates the murder and uncovers a plot to target or otherwise neutralize the other members of the Watchmen. He warns his retired comrades. These include Dan Dreiberg, the second Night Owl, Laurie Jaspecsic, the second Silk Spectre, Dr. Manhattan, a superhuman with the power to rearrange matter, and Adrian Veidt, or Ozymandias, who's known as the world's smartest man. As the story progresses, the personal histories and psychological complexities of each character are revealed to us, both through the present plot and flashbacks from their lives and the founding of the Watchmen. Now, despite Rorschach's investigation into the targeting of the Watchmen, the plot does succeed in driving Dr. Manhattan into exile on Mars after being manipulated into questioning his own humanity. With the disappearance of America's nuclear deterrent, this further escalates global nuclear tension. The climax of The Watchmen that occurs later, when Night Owl and Rorschach discover that Adrian Veidt, Ozymandias, has orchestrated the comedian's murder and all of the subsequent events in an attempt to prevent nuclear war. Confronted by the two in his Antarctic hideout of Karnak, Veidt reveals that his plan involved faking an alien attack on New York City, which would kill millions but unite the world in common fear of an extra-dimensional species or attack. At this point, Manhattan and Silk Spectre then show up, and in a last-ditch effort to save his own life from Dr. Manhattan, Veidt turns on a panel of TVs with news broadcasts from around the world showing global peace being achieved in the wake of the attack on New York. Rorschach refuses to compromise his moral compass and threatens to expose the truth to the world. And in a moment that perfectly encapsulates the question of, do the ends justify the means, Dr. Manhattan kills Rorschach to maintain the peace brought about by Veidt's atrocity. The story ends in a sort of epilogue with Dan and Laurie adopting new identities, attempting to live a normal life, and Rorschach's journal, which contains the truth about Veidt's plan, sits unread in a newspaper office, leaving the ultimate fate of the world ambiguous. On rereading this, though, one of my favorite parts outside of the direct plot was that we also get the origin stories of each individual member of the Watchmen spread throughout the book. For example, Rorschach's story is shaped by his early childhood abuse and days of vigilantism where he was confronted by the darkest acts of humans, leading to his adoption of this absolutist moral compass. We also learn about Silk Spectre's grooming at the hands of her mother, who turned Laurie into the second Silk Spectre, and her uncertainty of who her father is. Later on, it's revealed that Laurie is the daughter of the original Silk Spectre and the Comedian. We're then shown Dan Dreiberg's nostalgia and eccentricity, which drives him to ask the original Night Owl if he, Dan, can become the second Night Owl upon Hollis Mason, the first Night Owl's retirement. And we see Dr. Manhattan's lab accident that gives him his powers and how his powers begin to reshape his attitude towards humanity, as nothing more than sentient matter to be helped along like rats inside of a maze. And finally, we get the world travels of Adrian Veidt and extensive study of Alexander the Great. These two factors convince him of the power of globalism and the need to steer the fate of humanity. So more or less, we're given two plot points which run in parallel throughout The Watchmen, the present-day activities and the origin stories. I gained a lot of appreciation for this aspect of the story on this reread. When I first read The Watchmen, the present-day plot was sort of what hooked me and got me into the book, and I found the flashing back and the Tales of the Black Freighter and the inter-chapter, anecdotes to be a little frustrating and annoying because they just detracted from the main plot. But on this reread, I found myself really appreciating how Moore tied in the flashbacks and how he was able to do this in such a unique fashion with the medium of the graphic novel. To wrap up this summary, The Watchmen, like many other good books, is a story that you get something new out of every time you read it. So even if we weren't reading this for Guys Can Read as our April book of the month this year, I probably would have come back to this story before long. Now, reading The Watchmen in 2024 is, I'm sure, a different experience than reading issues of the comic when they were first released in 1986 and 1987. And with any older work, I believe in putting the work both in historical context, but then also examining it through the lens of the present. So to kick off, let's start with the past. In the early 1980s, the US and Russia were locked into a period known as the New Cold War. This was one phase of the larger Cold War, where cooling tensions between the countries were reignited due to hardline stances by Western leaders like Ronald Reagan in the US and Margaret Thatcher in the UK. The Reagan Doctrine was also gaining steam in the US, heightening the US pledge under the Truman Doctrine to aid, overtly and covertly, any attempts internationally to fight against communism. Military spending rose from 5.3% of GNP, or gross national production, during this period to 6.5% over 5 years, which ended in 1986. The Vietnam War had also ended about 10 years previously in 1975, though the war was still fresh in the minds of many Americans and was alluded to multiple times over the course of The Watchmen. And of course, in The Watchmen, the United States wins the Vietnam War with the help of Dr. Manhattan and the comedian. And one last important note here, the historical backdrop of 1986. Let's not forget that the US and Russia had missiles in firing distance of each other basically during this entire saga of the Cold War. Generally speaking, the fear of nuclear war between these two countries was alive and well when Moore was publishing The Watchmen in 1986 and 1987. The Watchmen also does rely on one piece of historical context outside of the Cold War, which is that a common enemy unites people. This is a theme we see crop up time and time again throughout history, and in The Watchmen, it's obviously masterminded by Adrian Veidt with the destruction of New York. As far as historical examples go, the U.S. has rallied a couple times as a country in the face of foreign aggression. For example, the economic boom following World War II and the nationalist sentiment following 9/11 are just two that come to mind. But the entire Western Bloc rallying against the USSR is probably the more prevalent example here in The Watchmen. We haven't ever really seen a global uniting due to a common enemy The Watchmen depicts in the wake of the New York attacks, but I'd argue that the closest we've come is the international response to global warming. Sadly, though, the unity in this case isn't quite the same as what's achieved by the threat of interdimensional aliens. Borrowing some ideas from behavioral economics, specifically Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, you could make the argument that because the consequences of global warming aren't as salient, i.e. they don't feel as real to us as terrorism did, that's why global warming isn't quite this sexy common enemy that the world should be fighting against right now. But anyway, let's now jump to the present. As good as it is, I found that the one lens that The Watchmen doesn't really hold up under in 2024 is feminism. Because the women in The Watchmen get a pretty bad shake, all things considered. Rorschach's mother is a prostitute. Sally Jupiter, the original Silk Spectre, was a hero who eventually turned to softcore pornography as a way to build her brand, and ends up hooking up with the comedian in a moment of weakness. The comedian, who the book reminds us frequently, did attempt to sexually assault her previously. And then we have the modern-day Silk Spectre, Laurie Jaspexik, who, as cool as she is, kind of gets handed off as a romantic partner in the book between Dr. Manhattan and Dan Dreiberg, the Night Owl. Her arc and eventually finding out the comedian is her father is probably the strongest emotional journey that we see over the course of the book, but she felt so underdeveloped to me as a character in the original Watchmen. That's why I really appreciated how HBO's follow-up series, whether or not you accept it as canon, did develop her character a little bit more and gave her a second life. All things considered, though, The Watchmen definitely does not pass muster when it comes to the Bechdel test. The last point I'll make here in the present interpretation of The Watchmen is an interesting parallel that I noticed between the world of The Watchmen in the 1980s and today's world, namely the shared sense that the world is ending. My generation, millennials, are increasingly fatalistic, at least in the US, about the state of things. Trust in institutions like federal government is down. Home ownership is declining among people my age. People are less well off than their parents for the first time, maybe ever, and global conflict is starting to flare up again in the Ukraine and Gaza. And overhead we have this hanging anvil of climate change, with the rope getting closer to breaking every year. Maybe this isn't unique to 2024, and maybe every generation feels like things are going to hell. I don't know. I just thought it was interesting that the world of today and the world of Watchmen both have this sort of collective dread fueling a lot of the populace. Now, let's get less analytical and more just fun. The Watchmen is chock full of really cool plot points and scenes, so I wanted to highlight my 3 favorites from the book, starting with number 3. This is kind of a cheat, but for number 3, I'm going to take the entirety of the first chapter, At Midnight All the Agents, because this is such brilliant exposition. Stakes are established really quickly with the murder of the comedian. We are introduced to Rorschach as the main perspective of the story, and we get the quick and dirty background on each of the Watchmen: Rorschach, Night Owl, Ozymandias, Dr. Manhattan, and Silk Spectre. Take this panel, for instance. Manhattan's responding to Rorschach's question as to why he's unconcerned about the death of the comedian, and we get 2 pieces of information from the jump on Manhattan and Lord Spexic. First off, we learn that Manhattan's powers have made him detached, unable to relate to humans, and largely unconcerned about death. And second, we get this reaction from Laurie, which can be interpreted in one of 2 ways, which are both revealing. Either 1, she's reacting to the comedian's dying based on her mother's history with him, and we begin to establish the emotional stakes between Laurie and Edward Blake. Or number 2, she's reacting to the callousness from Dr. Manhattan, which begins to highlight her anger at being a kept woman for him and her inability to relate to him. Both of these have implications later on in the story. Now, I don't think you can get away with doing exposition this sharp and fast without the medium of the graphic novel, but even so, it is a huge testament to how well Moore and Gibbons work together on this story. For number 2, the climax of this book and Vaight's confession that he's been orchestrating this the entire time and is behind the murder of the comedian is... From the moment that Rorschach and Night Owl realize that Veight has been the one pulling the strings, and that Veight was the one who killed the comedian, the stakes start ratcheting up so quickly. Veight giving us his origin story by way of the servants working for him at Karnak, Rorschach and Night Owl approaching Karnak and Antarctica, then Veight explaining how he killed the comedian, convinced the artist and scientist to build a fake monster for New York, and isolated the rest of the Watchmen. Everything just builds so fast from this point where Rorschach and Night Owl find out that Veight is the one behind everything. And after Night Owl asks Veight when he was planning to detonate the creature in New York, Veight responds with one of the coldest villain lines I've ever seen. Dan, I'm not a Republic serial villain. Do you seriously think I'd explain my masterstroke if there remained the slightest chance of you affecting its outcome? I did it 35 minutes ago. Straight up chills. And to his credit, Matthew Goode kills this scene in the Watchmen movie as well.
I'm not a comic book villain. Do you seriously think I'd explain my masterstroke to you if there were even the slightest possibility you could affect the outcome? I triggered it 35 minutes ago.
Also, I love that this is basically the antithesis to that one scene from The Incredibles.
You sly dog! You got me monologuing!
There's 2 types of villains, folks. You're either a Syndrome or an Ozymandias. And finally, here's my number 1 favorite scene from The Watchmen. It is the prison break scene where Night Owl and Silk Spectre get Rorschach out of prison. I get so goddamn hyped up every time I read Chapter 8, Old Ghosts. The introduction of Big Figure, who's a pretty dangerous mob boss, sets the scene for this chapter so perfectly. We know that there's a countdown. We know that the prison is basically going to erupt. And we know that at that point, Big Figure and his boys are coming for Rorschach. The writing in this chapter from Moore is so punchy and frankly badass that it's just tough not to root for Rorschach here. Take this example after Rorschach kills one of Big Figure's henchmen. Then the bastard's gonna find out what the score is. 1-0, your move. Nice. Then taking out the second guard by conducting the charge from the arc welder through water from the smashed cell toilet. Also sick. Never disposed of sewage with toilet before. Obvious, really. That's my Rorschach voice. And finally, when Dan and Laurie show up, we get Rorschach walking into the bathroom to kill Big Figure while Laurie's complaining about him not being grateful. A small aside, but this really made the scene funny to me. Lots of love here all around. Night Owl and Silk Spectre are being badass again after being retired. Rorschach murks Big Figure and his henchmen, and a lot of the art from Gibbons in this chapter is awesome. Okay, now, who should read The Watchmen? Off the bat, The Watchmen's obviously a graphic novel or collection of comic issues, which I understand might scare some people off at first. Truly though, I would say anybody can get into the story even if the medium is new to you. I think by now the world is familiar too with superhero properties, thanks in no small part to the MCU. So the basic tenets of like origin story, present day, moral conundrums that come with power should be familiar to most readers. Basically, if you're a fan of superhero stuff, I think you'll love this, and even if you're not, it's still pretty accessible. Now, on the other hand, I'd say that if you're not just like apathetic towards superhero content, but actually dislike it and know that it's not for you, you may not get into The Watchmen. While none of the characters, aside from Dr. Manhattan and kind of Adrian Veidt, have superpowers, the masked vigilante fighting crime theme is still very much alive and well in The Watchmen, and it's strong enough where you might not get into the story if you know that that's something you don't like. Also, if you typically don't gel with like science fiction, since this is sort of set in an alternate 1985, you may not want to do the suspension of disbelief thing that's required to really like get lost in this story. However, if you like historical fiction, I'd say that there's probably enough elements of that here with the geopolitical landscape and the Cold War backdrop where you will enjoy this book. And that's a wrap on today's book report on The Watchmen, written by Alan Moore and illustrated by Dave Gibbons. Where do you go from here? Well, for starters, I'd love it if you could like this video and subscribe to the Guys Can Read channel on YouTube. It helps out the channel and tells me that I'm not yelling about books into the void. Then, if you think that talking about this book or others with a group of guys nationwide sounds cool, you are in luck. Use the Google form linked in the description to sign up for the Guys Can Read mailing list and or join a live, in-person book club discussion in your city. And finally, if you find yourself wanting to read the book reviewed in this video, go and check out the video description for a link to the Guys Can Read page on bookshop.org. We are an affiliate partner and receive a small percentage of revenue from book sales through our shop on the site. That's all, but thanks again, and see you next time.